the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph, saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
I think I'm so filled with the Spirit from that music that I might just want to keep singing. Just thinking about the love of God, and thinking about all that He's done, and thinking about how the music reminds us of that, thinking about where we are today and where we're going in our lives. I think I'm just filled with the Spirit right now, but I'm not going to keep singing, I'm just going to keep going. I love Joseph. I love the stories in the Bible a little bit because I'm a psychologist, and I think that was the gift that God gave to me. And so anything that's about a story about a person really speaks to me. And so Elijah normally speaks to me. I have a little bit of a Jonah spirit, but when I thought about what we were going to talk about today, Joseph kept coming in my head. And I know I'm wrestling with some issues, and Joseph is speaking to me, so if you all don't mind a little bit, that's just the way it goes sometimes when you're preaching. I'm going to give my own sermon.
Amen.
If y'all feel like it's speaking to you along the way, you can give me a little amen, keep me going. Is that all right? All right, amen. So let's bow and do a word of prayer first. Oh, Heavenly Father, we're just so grateful that you're present in our lives and that we don't understand what happens on a day-to-day basis. But we know that you have the plan, and somehow, even when we forget, you do mean it all for the good. We just ask, Lord, that you continue to allow your Spirit to be with us, that there are particular lessons that we need to learn today to help us to maintain our faith, that you will open that up for us, that you will help us to see in the midst of where we are, that there is a good plan, and that you have a place for us to go, that you promise to keep us and to carry us through that. I just ask, Lord, that you allow this very humble vessel to be your mouthpiece, that the word that you would have would be received and delivered well. It is in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so we are doing Maintaining Faith Through Lessons Learned because when I got the email for a title, twice, because I think I ignored the first one, that's what came to me. I knew what would come to me this morning would be a real title, and so here we go. It's really about the backstory. It's really just about the backstory. When you look at somebody great and you wonder how they got to be that place where they are in their lives, all you see is the greatness. But you have to remember it's really about the backstory.
Amen.
And the backstory is how you learn to maintain your faith. Those lessons learned that are part of someone's backstory is how their faith helped them to grow and how you see them today. You may write me down in history
Yes.
with your bitter, twisted lies. You may tread me in the very dirt, but still, like dust, I'll rise. Does my sassiness upset you? Why are you beset with gloom? 'Cause I walk like I've got oil wells pumping in my living room. Just like moons and just like suns, with the certainty of tides, just like hopes springing high, still I'll rise. Did you want to see me broken? Bowed head and lowered eyes, shoulders falling down like teardrops weakened by my soulful cries? Does my haughtiness offend you? Don't you take it awful hard, 'cause I laugh like I've got gold mines digging in my own backyard. Out of the huts of history's shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean, leaping and wide, welling and swelling, I bear in the tide. Leaving behind nights of terror and fear, I rise into a daybreak that's wondrously clear. I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise, I rise, I rise. Now, all of you should recognize that poem. If not, please come see me afterwards. But it is by the beloved Maya Angelou. And when I started thinking about the backstory and what the backstory means and who is important to me in my life and how I get through those times where I need to learn lessons of faith, Maya Angelou was one of the ones that popped to me. I was able to speak pretty early on in church, and Maya Angelou's Still I Rise poem was one of the first ones that I was able to say. Helped to give me a little bit of my courage in speaking. But Angelou had a backstory. You saw her, you see her in her culmination, giving an inaugural poem at the inauguration of Bill Clinton when he was sworn in to be president. And she looks great before she died. She was someone that we all beheld in awe. Her words inspired, her novels encouraged. But she had a backstory. You may or may not know that she had a difficult childhood. And if you haven't read I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, I highly recommend it. Her parents divorced, split up when she was really young, and she and her older brother were sent to live with their father's mother in Stamps, Arkansas, really little bitty town, where there was just a small community. But Arkansas, in the day when Maya Angelou grew up, was filled with discrimination and racism, and she and her family, of course, were victims of that. And you see that a little bit in her poem, I Rise, because that's part of her backstory. You may or may not know that she suffered horrific trauma as a child. She was actually raped and assaulted. And then, by her mother's boyfriend at the time, her uncle found out about the rape and killed the boyfriend. She had her own personal assault. She witnessed the outcome of the assault in a very traumatic way. And yet somehow she was still able to write about how she rises. So if you see her standing and think about her as a great poet, standing at the height of any poet's dream, providing an address for the inauguration, you could say, wow, what a strong woman, what a woman of faith, what a woman of power, what a woman to be encouraged by. But you miss the backstory. And what's critically important is understanding that backstory. She could not have written about rising had she not had something to rise from. She could not encourage us to go forward if she had not been so traumatized, but yet knew that there was a place to go forward. And so that takes us to Joseph, our main character. We got to read a little bit about Joseph's story. Now, I love Genesis is probably one of my favorite books in the Bible because it's full of stories from beginning to the end, and all of the stories that point forward. But I love the story of Joseph for a number of reasons. Well, first, because there's a musical, and I like the music. I'm not going to sing that. Joseph was the son of Rachel, who was his father's beloved. So if you know the backstory of Joseph a little bit, there was Isaac and Esau, and then Jacob, who became Israel. And he worked, the brothers had a fight, he ended up working for the love of his life for 7 years, but at the end of the 7-year period, he was tricked and given her sister Leah to marry. No phase, he worked for another 7 years to get Rachel. Then there was this battle between who could have kids. Our wombs are shut up, take my handmaid. So by the end, there were 12 children. But Joseph was the one from Rachel, the woman he worked 14 years for and that he truly loved. Now, there are all kinds of horrible parenting skills in this story. You should not have a favorite child. Your favorite child should not have a specially made, multicolored coat. Your brother should not have to work in the field while your favorite son walks around in his favorite coat, running and tattling. So he was younger than the older brothers, but his job really was to wear his coat, go out, see what they were doing, come back and report back to their father. You can imagine that that created a little bit of jealousy, bitterment, resentment from his brothers. And then to top it off, this crazy dreamer has these dreams. So as read in our passage, oh wow, I had a dream. We were all out and your little sheaf's bent down to my sheaf. Not the thing to say when in the favorite coats. We're not out in the fields. And then he goes on, he has a second dream, and even the moon and the stars, the sun, they're all bowing to me. And his dad's like, you know what, dude? I hope you're not telling me someday down the road I'm going to come back and be bowing down to you. But that was his dream. And Joseph took that, and it was a really important part of his backstory. He took that dream, he kept that, his promise from God, and it aided him the entire part of his journey. So as the story goes, of course, the brothers who are very jealous plot to kill him. They get intercepted by another brother who says, hey, let's not kill him, but let's throw him in this pit here, and we'll leave him in the pit. Caravan comes, they have a little bit of mercy on him. Actually, I think they had a little bit more fear of their father. They take him out of the pit, they sell him, and Joseph is sold away into slavery. Now, if you are not thinking about the promises of God and having experiences where you built your faith, that would be the end of your dream. Here I am, I'm innocent, I'm wearing my beautiful coat. They took my coat, they killed a goat, they dipped it in the blood, they took it to my father. He thinks I'm dead, all is lost. But Joseph kept his dream. He kept his promise of God, and it became a part of his backstory that helped him as he maintained his faith. Okay. The story continues. Joseph gets sold to Potiphar. He's in Potiphar's house. Joseph must have been a very handsome man because Potiphar's wife decided, well, you know what, I don't like that man, I don't like him. And so she made several advances. Come on, Joseph, he's gone, it'll just be between me and you. And why not? I'm away from my family, I'm out of the promised land, I don't know when I'll get to have a future, I've got everything, why not take this lovely woman? But Joseph, in his backstory, remembered the promise of God, and he denied her several times. And if you remember, as the story continues, at one point she was so enraged and he was so distraught that he ran out, he left his outer cloak. She told all the servants and she told her husband, look what Joseph has done, he's tried to possess me. And so what happens to Joseph? He's certainly not elevated to the point where people are going to come and bow down to him. He's thrown in prison. For me, that would have been the end. Being sold for my family would have been first strike. I don't get the dreams, and now I'm in prison. You're in strike too, God. I don't understand this. I'm struggling with my faith. But Joseph didn't struggle with his faith. He was so faithful. He had so much integrity. He worked so well that the jailer said, you know what? I don't even have to come. You got this, Joseph. I'm putting you in charge of all of the other prisoners. And only remembering God's promise to him, even though he had no idea how that promise was going to be fulfilled, maintained, sustained, and kept him going. Well, the story goes on. Pharaoh has the cupbearer, the other person just flew out of my head. Oh well, there's two people, the baker, thank you, and they're in prison. As it turns out, they have dreams. No one can interpret the dream, they're very distressed. But Joseph, the dreamer, can interpret the dream. And he tells them, no big deal. One of you, wow, this is great. I think it's the baker. Your dream means you're going to get out of here in a couple of days, but he's going to kill you. The cupbearer has a dream. Your dream means you're going to be restored. You're going to go back and serve as the cupbearer. And when they get released, because the dreams were true as Joseph predicted, he says to them, please, please, when you get out of here, remember me. But they didn't. The baker was killed. The cupbearer was restored. Joseph languished for another 2 years in prison. For me, that would have been strike three, God. I had my chance. I worked my magic. I interpreted the dreams for you. I served you. I maintained my sense of integrity. But I'm still in prison. Well, as it turns out, the Pharaoh has these dreams he's quite distressed about. There's these lean years with big wheat and plenty, and then there's these strong years, there's these lean years with cows. The cows get sickly, they get eaten up. He has no idea what it means. The cupbearer remembers his promise and says, oh, wait, there is a dream interpreter in prison. Let's go get him and bring him back. And so he comes out of jail. He interprets for the Pharaoh. We're going to have great years of harvest, great years of plenty, 7, but they're going to be swallowed up by 7 intense years of famine, such that the land has never seen. They're pleased with the interpretation. And you know what happens to Joseph? He becomes the number 2 in the land. He becomes, in part, the charge of all of the harvest that they have for those 7 years. And they store up so much in Egypt that he becomes very wealthy. He marries. He has his own children. It's still not the dream, though, that God promised him. So even in that time of plenty, even when he's been restored, even when he starts to live what we would call the good life, he still has to maintain his sense of faith. The story goes, the father, the brothers, they end up in famine. The father sends them to Egypt. They don't recognize Joseph. Years have passed. He tricks them. He puts silver back in their packs. They go back home with food. They realize they have the silver. They're totally freaked out. What should we do? You've brought shame on the family. My son is gone, and now we're about to die. They get to the point where they have no choice but to go back to Egypt. They go back. It's discovered that they've taken the silver. They get punished, and Joseph says to them, bring the youngest child. He knows it's his brother Benjamin. They don't know it's Joseph, and so they have a dilemma to do. Do we go and starve? Do we bring our brother? They eventually bring the brother. They eventually bring the father. And then the dream becomes fulfilled. When the father dies, they all bow down to him, as we read in Genesis 50. Okay. In order to understand how he was able to maintain faith, I think it's important for us to understand that backstory and begin to think about the lessons that Joseph may have learned from that. We could, of course, contrast it with another character, my favorite fan, Mr. Elijah. Mr. Elijah is one of the last remaining prophets. Those are one of my favorite stories because I think it says God has a sense of humor. So he brings the prophets of Baal. He brings the Israelites. He tells them in 1 Kings 18, we're going to have a demonstration to prove who's God. Let's just do some sacrifices. Whichever God comes with fire, that's our God. And so they do. The prophets of Baal, they set their sacrifice, their altar up. They scream and cry. Elijah says, maybe your God's sleeping. Cry a little louder. They start to cut themselves. Maybe your God's in the bathroom. Just go. And so they're all day screaming and calling on their God. They don't come. Elijah very simply takes the altar, puts a trench around it, pours water on the altar, pours water in the trench so that it's filled with water. He does one simple short prayer. Not for me, Lord, but so that they know that it's you. Fire comes down, it consumes the water in the trench, it consumes the sacrifice. The children of Israel cry out, the Lord, he is our God. The Lord, he is our God. Now he's at the height of his story and feeling really great. Except there's one little problem. This lady called Jezebel. So in 1 Kings 19 we learn, and I'll read, Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah and said, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them." And Elijah, like me, was afraid, and he ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord." How many people have said that? At various times in your life. "Take my life, I'm no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. And all at once an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." I love to contrast Joseph and Elijah. They both have these really important moments. They both hear the voice of God. They're in deep, intimate fellowship and connection with God. But the end of their story becomes very different. Joseph takes his backstory to help him to maintain faith. Elijah takes the difficulty of his circumstances, not to lose faith totally, but to feel so frustrated that he just gives it all up to God. Some of you are nodding. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hand, but you know where you are in your life, and you're reflecting on your backstory. And the question you have to ask yourself is my spirit such that it's like Joseph's, and that I know that God gave me a promise, and I have no idea how he's going to work out the promise, and I'm okay with the fact that I don't know how he's going to work out my promise, but he promised me he is always faithful, and I'm going to rest on that. Yeah. Or is your story a little bit more like Elijah's? I'm gonna own it. Oh, that's it. I thought it was great. I thought that was the fulfillment. It's not. You know what? I'm done. Can't even imagine telling the great God of Jehovah, I am done with whatever this is, because my plan and your plan are not matching. Joseph at least knew that God's plan, greater than his, would lead to good. All right, so let's take a little bit of time to figure out how it is that Joseph kept his faith. Number one, through all of the years of turmoil, being in prison, he had to remember the promises of God. The question that begs you is, are you in the place where you are remembering the promises of God? Are you in a place where you're listening to the Spirit, where you're listening to the word of the Lord, where the Lord is able to communicate to you? Don't worry about the steps. Don't worry about the plans. I know the plans I have for you. Oh, of prosperity and of peace. Are you in the spot where you're remembering the promises of God? Because Joseph never lost that. He always remembered the dreams and the promise that God gave to him, even if it didn't make sense that one day his family would be bowing down to him. I think what's even more important in remembering that promise to God is that Joseph just remembered who God was. Yeah. Imagine the tribes of Israel were always telling the stories about what happened. We were always having promises and always in communication with God, and he never forgot the trials, the turmoils. He saw his family moving on the other side. We have to remember who God is. Do you today know who God is? Is he your provider when you're feeling like you're stretched and you don't have enough? Is he your shepherd when you're feeling like you need direction or you just need to be led next to those still waters? Is he your source of salvation? Is he your source of strength? Is he your source of hope? Do you know who God is in your life? So when you're standing and people are watching you and they're looking at you and saying, oh boy, they're in UIndy, they got a great future, they're going to get an excellent job, and you want to say, really? You don't even know the struggles.
Amen. Amen.
Are you in the position to tell your backstory? But even more important, are you in the position to tell how the lessons from your backstory helped to develop your faith? I think that Joseph very clearly was. So as he's in Potiphar's house, he remembers who he is. He remembers that he's a child of God and that he's been promised riches, that he's been promised peace. And so he didn't have to go with Potiphar's wife. He could step on the promises of God and remember And when people said to him, man, you're crazy. You see how beautiful she is? She won't tell. You won't have to tell. You can have it all. He was able to step firm on the promises of God. And then when he went to prison, he was able to spend some time reflecting on God's goodness, but also all of the lessons that he had been taught in Potiphar's house. Had he not been in prison, taken out of the pit and sold, he wouldn't have been able to be in Potiphar's house and learn to take over and run the entire household. All of those skills. I don't know why, Lord, you taught me how to be organized. I don't know why, Lord, you taught me how to talk to people. I don't know why, Lord, you taught me all these things. But when he was in prison, all the lessons, the sense of integrity, all of the work that he did was immediately picked up by the jailer. And he became in charge of all of that. And then when he came out of prison and he went to the Pharaoh and he interpreted the dreams, and the Pharaoh said, is there none as wise as he? He was elevated to be second in the land. But he was able to tell his backstory. You know how I can distribute all the wheat? Do you know how I can organize all of the people? Do you know how I can get all of the funds and sell it? Because I had experience in leading in the prison. And I had experience before leading in the prison, leading in Potiphar's house. Joseph was able to remember who God is, how God functions, and how God moved in his life. So the question that you have is, what's your backstory? What are the lessons that you're learning in your walk with the Lord? How is the lesson that you had in the 3rd grade that seems totally disconnected from anything that would happen at UND really the base root of why you're being able to be successful in UND? And you have to think about the promises and keeping them going. If you've forgotten that the Lord walks with you, then you need to learn. You need to remember He has promised to never leave us. He's promised never to forsake us. He's promised to always walk alongside of us. You can take then the promise that Joseph was able to give his brothers. I know you meant it for harm, but God meant it for my good. And God not only meant it for Joseph's good, He saved the world. He saved the Israelites. He saved the Egyptians by remaining faithful, by remaining honest, by maintaining his integrity, by maintaining a sense of worship, maintaining his commitment, his level of intimacy with God. If you feel like you're in a pit today, you just might be. But you should know that God promises that all things work for the good for those who are called.
Amen.
If you feel like you somehow have been in prison unfairly, you have to remember that God is always faithful to His promises to us. If for some reason you feel like you've been forsaken, that you've been abandoned, that you know you're with people and you know that God is there, but you're not feeling His love, you have to remind yourself that's a lie of the devil.
That's right.
Because God has always promised to be faithful, and God has always promised to walk alongside of us. And then you have to remind yourself, we have the best promise of life. Eternal life.
All right.
God has promised that not only will He walk alongside of us in this life, but that we are heirs. We are joint heirs with Christ.
Amen.
And every lesson that we have, the backstory that we have here on this earth, is only to prepare us for the ultimate glory that we'll have
Amen.
when we're in His presence. Amen.
Amen.